series, develop a little bit more about those lesser-known heroes in the Bible. We're going to look at 3 of them today that are found in the book of Daniel. And before we really look at those, I'm going to just ask you a question. And I think when I ask it, you guys are going to, most everybody in this room is going to know exactly what this point of reference is about. Are you ready? What do you think of when I say the word courage? Yeah, you all got that, didn't you? It wasn't that I said anything funny or anything. It was just, you all have seen The Wizard of Oz, and you know that's the way that lion talks about courage, you know. And when he first meets Dorothy, and he's talking all about how mean and buff and rough and tough he is and everything like that, and she goes over and bops him on the nose, and he starts crying, you know, because he doesn't really have any courage. So he doesn't believe until at the end of the movie, what? He finds out that the courage was always inside of him. It just needed to come out. You know, that's true of all of us. You know, we've all got courage. We face difficult circumstances, and sometimes it calls for levels of courage that we've never gone to before. But we've all got that courage inside of us. So today I want to talk to you about that theme, and I'm going to be in the book of Daniel, chapter 3. But the big idea of the message today is there are times life calls for courage under fire. I could have just left it alone. There are times life calls for courage, but I really want you to see what was going on in this story and how there are times we go through fire as well. So it's this idea that there are times when life just, it calls for a courage that needs to be extra special. It stands up under fire. I looked up the definition of courage in Webster's dictionary, and it said, mental or moral strength to venture and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. Mental or moral strength to venture and withstand danger, fear, or difficulty. Somebody else has said, and I don't know who to attribute this to, I didn't see it, but it says, courage is the most important of all virtues, because if you haven't courage, you may not have an opportunity to use any of the others. Think about that. It's foundational to using anything else. You got to have courage. It takes courage to do a lot of things in life, even to live the virtues that God calls us to. So when we think about courage today, we're going to think about 3 men. And they're young men. I mean, it depends on whose commentary you're reading, but some would say these were like teenagers, maybe as young as 13, 14 years old. Others think, well, they're maybe just young men, like maybe in the early 20s or something. But they're young men. And their names are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, again, I would ask this question, as I've asked on other times when I've referred to names out of the Old Testament especially, aren't you glad we don't name our children those names anymore? Now, one of them, maybe we do. The name Shad, I still hear that one around. That would be a shortened version of Shadrach. I don't know if anybody naming their kids Shadrach, but Shad is, I still hear that once in a while. And I think Meshach is very common in our world today. People will say, what do you mean? I don't ever hear anybody naming their kids named Meshach. Well, what did I just do with Shadrach? My own name, Timothy. People don't call me Timothy for the most part. They just call me Tim, the short form. The short form for Meshach is, and here comes the name, it's all over the place, me. A lot of people got me. Me, it's all about me, okay? There's that name that's out there. But then there's also this name of Abednego. I don't know what to do with that one. I really don't know what to do with that one, Abednego. I think about one of my professors in school, Dr. Strauss. He was raising a couple of daughters. And when it was time for bed, he used to tell them, all right, it's time. Meshach, and to bed we go. And they go to bed every night like that, you know. So I guess there's an application for that. But these 3 names are very strange names, but the guys who hold those names are very fascinating men, and they're great men, young men of courage. Now, their story is told in Babylon, not in Israel. Israel had been conquered, drug off into captivity, and there they are in Babylonia. And the great king Nebuchadnezzar ruled over Babylonia, and he was pretty full of himself. And the king decided one time that, I think what I'm going to do is have a big statue built, 90 feet tall. Can you imagine that? A 90-foot statue, and it's all gold-plated. And he had it put just outside the city in the plains around Babylon. And then he wanted to have everybody come and bow down to that. When he dedicated this thing, he wanted everybody to bow down when they heard the sounds of lots of instruments, and the herald would be calling out, you come and you worship. Everybody. No exceptions. So we get into Daniel chapter 3, And we drop down to around verse number 4, and we pick it up, that there's a herald who shouted out, "People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow down to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." That's an edict that's been given out. The king is obviously on board about this kind of a thing. So, the call is going out to do something that, in the minds of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, would be unthinkable. The call to do the unthinkable. For these men who have been steeped in understanding who God is, the Old Testament ways, these men would not go out and bow to a statue. They know that statue is not a real God. They know there's only really one God. They believe the Shema, the Lord our God, is one. There's nobody else. So for them to go out and do that would not even be thinkable for them. They worship the one true God. To do otherwise was unthinkable. So the three young men, based on that, had then the courage to say no. They said no to the thing that the rest of the culture was saying yes to. You know, the world is filled with lots of evil, and it's also filled with lots of things that maybe aren't necessarily evil, but they're things that will pull you away from God. This was definitely evil. This was idolatry, to worship another idol. They could not do that. They had the courage to say no. For us, in our world today, we're called upon to have the courage to say no. In the book of Titus, chapter 3, Paul writes to this young preacher these words in chapter, chapter 2, verses 11 and 12. It says, "For the grace of God," now notice that, tied into the grace of God, the grace of God has been revealed. That's going to call something out of us. When you see God's grace, recognize it, it calls something from us. The grace of God has been revealed, bringing salvation to all people. That's what God's extending. So what's our part? And we are instructed to turn from godless living and sinful pleasures. We should live in this evil world with wisdom, righteousness, and devotion to God. There it is. Nothing's changed from the days of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire to the time that Paul was writing to the time that we are living right now. There are going to be things that are going to call to us from the culture, from the world, to follow them and do these things. And some of them may not be necessarily evil or bad. But if they're going to pull you away from God, pull your devotion away from Him, where then you set yourself up to do the things of the world, you got to recognize that and say, no, I can't go down that road. Certainly worshiping idols. Certainly doing things that we know are evil, as the Bible instructs us and basic culture instructs us about certain evil things. But Christians also need to understand that we're called to bow down to gods that may not be necessarily evil, other than the result will be you're pulled away from God. What are those things? Well, we've mentioned it before. People are addicted to sports in our world today. They just bow down to sport anytime that they can. And they spend so much time invested in that that it pulls them away from any time with the Word of God or with God's people. It can pull them away. Fame can do that. Trying to pursue your own fame. Money. The pursuit of just, I got to have more, acquire more so I can have more. Entertainment. It's not just bowing down to those who are the entertainment industry, but it's your own form of entertainment. Whatever you choose to use as entertainment could be so ingrained in you that it pulls you away from God, and you're bowing down to that God. There are such things as people who follow celebrities, and they just, whatever the celebrities are doing, they think that's cool. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to cross over the line here, as I sometimes do. Cell phones. A lot of you know, I know, and I've said it before, that's a tool, and it can be used as a tool, but I think it's also being used as a god by many people because of the time and effort they devote to that. I mean, when I see post after post after post, and I'm not one who's sitting there looking, I look at my phone maybe 10 minutes a day that way. I'm looking for birthdays and anniversaries where I can say, happy birthday, happy anniversary. But I'm not one that posts a lot of stuff. I'm not one that spends a lot of time there. There's other things I need to be doing in my life other than be addicted to a cell phone. I'm just asking you, folks, take a look. Take a look how much time you spend there. Do you spend any amount of time like that in the Word of God or in prayer? I'm not just saying a token prayer here or there. I mean, people are devoted to these little things. They kind of rule our lives. It's all part of the culture. Something that can be used for good can also be such a thing that dominates your life that it just pulls you away from God. So, what God says to you is you need to have courage to remain faithful, to say no to a lot of things that are going on in the culture. But there's another thing that you need to understand about this. When we go to bowing down to these other gods, anything that is elevated to a comparable importance in our life that should be reserved for God, that's an idol. Something that's elevated of almost equal importance to that which God should hold in your life, that's an idol. These men would not give in to that idol at all. They said no. And they knew what it risked. Did you hear what I said when the edict was given? If you don't bow down, what's going to happen? We will throw you in a furnace of fire. Well, that's what their future is going to hold for them pretty immediately. So there's a courage to remain faithful, but then there's a courage to face intense confrontation. Sometimes it takes a little courage to say no to some things that are going on around you, and things in the culture that, all right, so I may, if I don't do what these guys are doing over here, they may not include me in their group. You know, it takes courage to say no on those kind of circumstances. Or just to walk away from certain things that you know are pulling you in the wrong direction. Just, you say no to that. There's a certain amount of courage to do, that you have to do that, but then sometimes that courage calls for an extra level of it because the confrontation you're going to get, it's not just a temptation, but a confrontation is very intense. The pressure is always on in our culture to conform, isn't it? In the case of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the pressure was ultimately intense because here's what it came down to. Do it or die. That's what it is. That's what they were being told. When the king, Nebuchadnezzar, was told, everybody came out and bowed down to the big statue except these three guys. They're over here worshiping a different god. And you know what the edict said. If they didn't come out and worship, they were going to be thrown into a fire. And the king knew that. And the scripture tells us that he went into an intense rage. He got furious. Get those boys in here in front of me right now. So the king looks at these boys and he says in chapter 3, second part of verse 15, I'm going to give you one more chance to bow down. You're going to hear the music and you're going to bow down. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing fire. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power? You hear the arrogance on the part of the king? You don't bow down here. I'm going to have you thrown into a fire, and there's no God who's going to save you from my power. Wow. He really is full of himself. It's not just about idols. He sees himself worthy of that worship himself. No God can save you from me. Do or die. What's it going to be, boys? I want you to notice what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew, what they believed. They believed this, that courage comes with God's faithfulness. If they stayed faithful to God, they knew he was always going to be faithful to them. So listen to the response in the 16th verse through the 18th verse. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into a blazing fire, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power." Oh, see, they took the issue right on. It's not just about this thing about worshiping this thing, but you say you have power over everybody and over every God. Well, he can save us from your power, your majesty. But if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. That's not going to happen. Throw us in a fire. God can save us if he wants to. He doesn't have to. It doesn't matter to us because we're going to keep serving God. We're going to be faithful to him because he's faithful to us. What a response that is. So what's the king say about that? He goes into a real rage. Then he says, "Oh, that fire you got going down there, stoke that thing up. I want it 7 times hotter than what it is right now." So, man, they started throwing the wood to it and getting that thing hotter and hotter all the time. Bind those guys up, those 3 boys, and throw them into the fire. So these soldiers do that very thing. They go and throw them into the fire. The heat is so intense, as they throw the boys into the fire, the heat overcomes them, and they die. The soldiers die. And the guys land in the fire, and they kind of get up. I guess they're bound and everything. They, okay, we're in here. Nothing's happening. They're not being consumed. You would think a fire that powerful would just absolutely melt them instantly. But they're walking around in there. You can have that kind of a feeling if you really believe that you serve a God who can deliver us from any kind of fire that we go through. It doesn't have to be a literal fire like this furnace, but there are times when life can be so difficult, so tough, that you're going through a fire. I mean, it's a difficult time, and you feel the heat, the pressure, the confrontation that comes from other people. Sometimes the circumstances just melt you. You can feel it. But we serve a God who is more powerful than all of that. More than that, his Son, Jesus Christ. He's the one who came. He's the one who gives us the courage to stand up, because he had the courage to stand up and do what is right. In the book of Hebrews, the 10th chapter, these words, beginning with verse 21, since we have a great high priest, and that's a reference to Jesus Christ, who rules over God's house, let us go right into the presence of God with sincere hearts, fully trusting him, for our guilty consciences have been sprinkled with Christ's blood to make us clean, and our bodies have been washed with pure water. Let us hold tightly, without wavering, to the hope we affirm for God, that he can be trusted to keep his promise. Wow. The writer of Hebrews is very clear about this. Jesus Christ came through everything on this earth for us. What he put up with, what he tolerated, the pain that he went through, the trials that he endured, he did it so that we might have forgiveness. But he also did it as an example. I'm with you. I'm the Christ who came through all that stuff. I'm here. I'm your high priest. I can take you right into the presence of God, and God will watch over every one of his people. Jesus has already conquered everything that we will ever face. So, you could say, increase the pressure. Keep piling it on. I've been recently reading some posts that have been put out there on martyrs around the world right now. We don't often hear about it. We hear about Christians undergoing persecution. Here in America, the persecution might be that there's laws that are being sought to be made that would make the churches more difficult to even operate. There are Christians who are having to put up with either conform to us, or you lose your job, or maybe it just might be that somebody's just going to mock you. That might be the persecution you go through. But Christians are under persecution here in the United States, but not like they are in other parts of the world. We know about what ISIS has done to Christians over in the Middle East, but I've been reading about what's going on in North Africa. I've been reading about places like Nigeria, where they take a pastor out and behead him in front of everybody, so it maybe strikes fear into the people, and then they can make the people walk away from their faith. And they're not doing it. It's always been an interesting thing, and these people that do this kind of stuff don't understand historically, you persecute the church grows. Not only in number, but it grows stronger. Persecution does the opposite of what they expect. But I admire the courage of these people who, in the face of just literally the face of death, still stand up for Christ. Courage. It's risking things. I read years ago the book about Ernest Shackleton, the guy who was the Antarctic explorer. Perhaps you've read that book. His ship, the Endurance, as it went down there and got caught in those ice floes like that, and it crushed the ship. And those guys, for several months, they survived, and they finally got rescued. But it was all the things that Shackleton kept doing as a leader to inspire courage in those men. Afterwards, he said a lot of things, but one of the things he said was, the world is a huge place. How will you know where you fit in unless you explore beyond your comfort zone? Takes courage to explore beyond your comfort zone, to risk that there could be a fire here that I need to go through. But that's how we grow. That's how we get great things done. And it takes courage. Courage that God is willing to give his people. So we talk about a courage that calls us to remain faithful, a courage that is going to stand up even in the face of intense confrontation. I want you to know, though, that God is always going to be there for you. There is a courage also that God rewards. What happened to these guys here? They were thrown into the fire. What happened to them? Well, God was in the fire with his people, and he took care of them. He promised he would always be there for his people. And Jesus extended that promise. I will be with you always, even till the end of the age. He's in the stuff of life, even if it's a fire that you're in. He's in it with you. So what happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Well, God shows up. That's what he does. In the midst of a fire, God shows up. The boys are in the fire. They're standing around, but there's more. Look at Daniel chapter 3, verses 24 and 25. The king is watching. He's waiting for them just to evaporate because of the intensity of the fire. But it says, but suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted, I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god. Wow. I mean, try to get your head around what Nebuchadnezzar's seen. 3 guys thrown into the fire. They're not dead. They're not burned or anything. They're just walking around like it's taking a stroll on a Saturday afternoon. And there's a 4th one in there, and he looks like a god. This isn't the only time that this kind of thing happens in Scripture. There's time and time again where God shows up. Sometimes it's in the form of an angel to offer encouragement, direction. You know, this is what God does. Sometimes they might point and say, that's God himself doing it. And sometimes it might be the Son of God. That there's evidence that maybe Jesus had incarnated at that point just to give courage for whatever the situation was. Well, whatever it is, that 4th one walking around, Nebuchadnezzar recognized that looks like a god if I've ever seen a god. And I think you also realize he's probably thinking, has to be, or otherwise he's meant to be dead right now. 4, not 3 are in the fire, and the 4th looks like a god. Some things are just hard to explain when God shows up. I thought about this a little bit. If God wanted to deliver Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you know what he could have done? As they were being thrown into the fire, God could have just went, snuffed out the fire. What would that have looked like? Got this fire all stoked up 7 times hotter than it normally is, and all of a sudden it's gone just like that because God snuffs it out. The 3 guys would have looked around and said, there's no fire here, King. King might have ordered another fire built and everything, but God could have done it like that. Why did God choose just simply to show up in the fire? Because I think it shows his power even more so than just if he simply snuffed out the fire, that he is with his people. It's a demonstration to the 3 boys for one thing, but it's also a demonstration to the king. God stays with his people. Be assured that God is in whatever fire is going on in your life right now. Some of us might be cruising right along. We don't really have any real serious concerns or anything. We're not going through any kind of fire. And some of you might be going through a fire right now. Maybe you just found out of something in your health that's a real challenge to you right now. Maybe you've been going through that for quite a long time. Maybe there's always that threat that, is my job going to hold up? Life situations can turn on us at any moment. So I don't know what you might be going through and what kind of a fiery ordeal it is. I just know this, that God is in that fire with you, and he then rewards his courageous people. He rewarded these guys with life, but there's going to be more. As the king looked down there, the king says, get those boys out of there. He didn't go near the fire. I think he stayed a safe distance away, but he said, come out. Come over here. And the boys walk out of the fire, and they walk right over to the king. Boy, I understand why he didn't want to go near that fire. He knew how hot it was. He saw what happened to the soldiers, so he stays a safe distance away. I'm a respecter of fire, too. I've had a few experiences with fire. I've had literally, if you will, a baptism of fire over at the old church. We used to have an old heater that we used to heat up the baptistry. It was down in the basement, but was wired up to, or piped up to the main baptistry up in the auditorium, and we put the water in, and you turn that heater on, and it heated up the baptistry. So I was going to do a baptism during the week. This is when I was young and stupid. I'm just old and stupid now, but when I was really young and stupid, I went downstairs so I could get this ready. I don't need anybody to come over here. I could go over and get Henry Sullivan, lived on the corner. Henry come over to do it. He'd been doing it for years. I don't want to bother Henry. I'll just go down and do it. I didn't know that this is such an old heater that there was always a little bit of gas that was leaking around it. Always. It would evaporate, but there was always a little bit of gas. So what Tim does is goes down, opens up the spigot on the thing, get that gas going real good like that, not realize there's already a buildup like that. I light the thing. It blows up right there in my face, and I stand there. I thought, this isn't good. You know, I could feel a little bit of burning on my wrist and hand, and I could feel a little bit around my eyes like this. It was lit. So I walked around the corner, and there was a restroom right there, and I looked into the mirror. My hair is all kinky and curly all over in the front like this. My eyebrows are all but gone. And I stood there just going, that wasn't the smartest thing I ever did. From that time forward, I went over and got Henry Sullivan, and Henry came over and lit that thing for me. One time was enough for me, but so I literally had, if you will, a baptism of fire dealing with that baptistry over there. Some of you, life blows up on you like that, doesn't it? Unexpected things, and you just have to deal with some real trauma in your life. But God always takes care of his people. Look at Daniel chapter 3, the second half of verse 26 and also verse 27. It says that the king shouted out this, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. Then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. Whew. Nothing that you would expect being around a fire like that happened. These guys are standing there just like nothing had ever happened that day at all. Amazing, isn't it? They not only had no damage and no injuries, they didn't even smell like they'd been near a fire. The king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, gave them higher responsibilities in the kingdom of Babylon. And he also decreed this, that if anybody even said anything about those guys that was bad, I'm going to have them cut up to pieces. Then this, there is no other God who can rescue like this. Nebuchadnezzar kind of forgot about the big statue. He forgot about other gods that he may have known about. He said, you know, no other God can rescue like this God can. If God brings you to it, he will bring you through it. That's not original with me, but I heard that and I liked it. If God brings you to it, he will bring you through it. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the great poet, said this, all I have seen teaches me to trust the Creator for all I have not seen. Isn't that good? You can have courage to stand up for things you can't even see because God has already seen it. He already's in it. And he'll take care of his people. I want to just say this before I close today. This message has great application for all you young people out there. Did you hear me mention it a couple of times that these were young men, possibly as young as 13 years of age up to maybe their early 20s? Young people tied into God, devoted to God, and have the courage then to stand for everything that's right. That's the challenge for you as young people today. Some of us, we faced challenges. We faced baptisms of fire, and we've come through it, and with God's grace, it's always worked out well. It's your turn. You're going to face things. They're not going to be pleasant. There's going to be challenges that you don't want to take on. But there's victory out there. If you have the courage that God will give you, there's victory out there for your life. And you can make a difference in this world. Conclusion is this. God gives us courage to live in the chaos of this world. And this world is very chaotic. You need his wisdom. You need his courage. He's still in the fire with his people. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for